It wasn't a speech, it wasn't a press release, it wasn't even announced out loud. But what happened in the dead of night, with no royal pageantry, no ceremonial drumroll, just a quiet, calculated edit on the official website of the British monarchy, may go down as the most consequential move of King Charles's reign. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Prince Harry, removed, not from his palace, not from his country, but from the royal family's digital lineage. It sounds trivial, doesn't it? Until you realize how the monarchy uses silence. Until you realize that erasure, for them, isn't just a technical update, it's a message. And this time, that message may signal something far more drastic than anyone expected. So let me ask you something. What happens when a king begins to delete his own blood? Because that's where this story starts. Not with Harry leaving, but with King Charles finally locking the door behind him. And as we speak tonight, what's coming next could rewrite royal succession law itself. Yes, that's how serious this has become. But to understand the stakes, we have to go slow. Because this isn't a tabloid feud or some family tiff in California sunshine. This is a long game of legacy, power, and silence. And in this story, the king's silence is louder than any crown. Let's go back. Not years, not even months. Just a few days ago, royal watchers noticed something different. The official royal.uk website had made a subtle change. Not to a blog post, not to a press gallery, to the core identity page of Prince Harry. His HRH? Gone. Stripped. Deleted. His military affiliations? Missing. No mention of his once cherished honorary titles. No nod to his royal patronages. Nothing linking him to the legacy he was born into. It was surgical. And cold. Now, for the average viewer, maybe that sounds like housekeeping. You'd be forgiven for shrugging. But that's the trap, because this wasn't a normal update. It wasn't part of routine digital maintenance. It was a deliberate revision of history. And the real story isn't just what they removed. It's what they're preparing to do next. Let me explain. For the monarchy, the royal website is not a casual portfolio. It's an extension of constitutional identity. Every image, every paragraph, every placement, down to the order of names, is reviewed by internal teams, PR strategists, legal advisors, and at times, the sovereign himself. So when Harry's identity was quietly erased from that system, without ceremony, it wasn't an oversight. It was a signal. And that signal was not just meant for Harry. It was meant for the press, for Parliament, for Commonwealth nations, and for us. It said, this chapter is closed, except it's not. Because just days after that edit, a series of strange, unconfirmed, but highly specific rumors began swirling inside Whitehall, across palace insiders, and in encrypted journalist group chats, that King Charles was preparing something unprecedented, something formal, possibly irreversible, something that would not just strip Harry of his ceremonial recognition, but sever his constitutional right to inherit the throne. Let that settle in for a moment. Prince Harry, who remains fifth in line to the British throne, behind William and William's 3 children, could be legally and permanently removed from the royal line of succession, not just in practice, but in law. You might be thinking, can a king even do that? The answer is murky. But what we do know is this: behind palace doors, the conversation has begun. And the pressure, political, emotional, symbolic, is mounting on all sides. Charles is not just a grieving father or a reluctant monarch. He is a man cornered by legacy, by scandal, and by time. And if insiders are right, this next move, this fatal move, could change the future of the monarchy forever. Now, before we go further, I want to make something clear. This isn't a takedown piece. It's not gossip. It's not here to mock or sensationalize. This is an investigation into how one of the oldest monarchies on Earth is rewriting its own bloodlines. Because if Charles does remove Harry from the line of succession, he wouldn't just be cutting ties with his own son, he'd be rewriting the very structure of the crown's future. And that's where things get dangerous. Let's talk about the timing. Why now? Why, after 4 years of public estrangement, 2 tell-all interviews, a best-selling memoir, a Netflix documentary, a royal funeral, and a coronation. Why now? In the aftermath of what seemed like a final break? Well, that's where things get chilling, because sources suggest that this wasn't Charles acting out of spite. It wasn't even retaliation for Spare, although insiders say that book cut deeper than anything since Diana. This was strategic, because something else is coming. Something that forced the king to accelerate a plan that had allegedly been sitting, quietly, in a red box since early 2022. Some say it's political, that Commonwealth nations are growing uneasy about having an absentee prince with a transatlantic lifestyle so high in the line of succession. Others say it's legal, that an obscure constitutional clause written decades ago has been quietly triggered by Harry's repeated attacks on the institution. Still others say it's personal, that after the Queen's death and in the shadow of Camilla's ascension, Charles has made a private vow the crown will not pass to a man who once called it a toxic prison. So what's the truth? That's the story we're here to tell, because over the next hour we're going to walk you through a network of subtle edits, off-record meetings, internal correspondence, and a growing campaign inside the palace to not just forget Harry, but to erase his future entirely. And at the center of it all, a monarch torn between duty and fatherhood. Let's be honest, there's something heartbreaking about this. A son who walked away, a father who looked the other way, and now a kingdom caught in the middle. But heartbreak doesn't stop history. And tonight, we're going to show you what may be the most fateful act of this new Carolian age. We'll take you into the whispered meetings at Kensington, the private correspondence between Harry and Charles that, allegedly, never reached reconciliation, the role Camilla and William played, both publicly and behind the scenes, the legal hurdles that could delay but not prevent Harry's removal, and the dangerous precedent this sets for royal bloodlines going forward. We'll also ask, what happens to Archie and Lilibet? If Harry is removed, what does that mean for their future? Are they protected or collateral? And perhaps most shockingly, we'll reveal a clause hidden in plain sight during the coronation that might give Charles the final tool he needs to make this permanent. But we won't get there just yet, because before any of that, you need to see exactly what was changed and what it means. Because what they took down from the website is nothing compared to what they're about to put in place, and what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. They didn't send out a press statement. There was no Buckingham Palace press officer briefing the Sunday papers. No tweet, no commemorative video, not even a whispered leak to the tabloids. It just happened. Like someone opening a vault, slipping something precious out of place, and quietly closing the door again before anyone could notice. Except someone did notice, and once they did, it couldn't be unseen. It began, as many things do in the digital age, with a screenshot. Not from a royal insider, not from an embittered ex-staffer, but from an anonymous Twitter account run by a self-described royal IT nerd. The post was short, clinical, almost eerie in its precision. Royal.uk updated today. Prince Harry's profile changed. HRH reference gone. Military titles scrubbed. No explanation. And just like that, the internet lit up. The change was real. Archive snapshots confirmed it. Side-by-side comparisons showed it in brutal, undeniable clarity. What had once been a full royal profile, detailing the Duke of Sussex's military appointments, honorary titles and roles within the royal household, had been reduced to something sterile. Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, no His Royal Highness, no Captain General of the Royal Marines, no mention of his past roles as Commonwealth Youth Ambassador or President of the Queen's Commonwealth Trust. Gone. Even the subtle word choices had been sharpened. Where the previous profile had referred to ongoing charitable work within the royal family, the new version spoke of Harry's life prior to stepping back. It was a purge. Not just of titles, but of memory. And make no mistake, this wasn't an accident. Because here's how the royal website works. Every edit must be signed off by at least 3 departments. 1 in the royal communications team, 1 in the private secretary's office, And one, yes, always, one in the sovereign's own household. This was not a rogue employee pushing a broken update. This was deliberate. Deliberate in timing. Deliberate in execution. Deliberate in message. The erasure wasn't just symbolic. It was strategic. And the moment that became clear, the narrative began to shift from what was removed to why now. Because let's be honest, the HRH title was already informally dropped. The military honors had already been relinquished post-Megxit. These weren't new developments in principle, but the quiet digital update made something crystal clear. The palace wasn't waiting for reconciliation anymore. They had closed the door. No statement, no open wound, just silence. That's how the institution moves when it wants to send a message without inviting a reply. And to those paying attention, the message was deafening. But it gets stranger, because this wasn't the only edit made that day. A deeper dive into the royal.uk content logs, publicly accessible with the right tools, revealed something chilling. The order of succession page had been recoded. Harry's name was still listed, yes. He remained fifth in line. But the metadata attached to his entry had been altered. Gone were internal tags linking his name to working royal. Gone were cached categories assigning him to the senior members of the royal household. And, perhaps most cryptically of all, a previously public footnote referencing his children's birthright claim under the letter's patent was removed entirely. If you're not familiar with royal website structure, that may sound technical, but to those who know how these systems are maintained, it was a red flag, a digital breadcrumb. Because when the metadata disappears before the headline does, it usually means the headline is next. So, was this a warning shot? Or was it the first step in something more permanent? Let's talk about intent, because edits like this don't happen in isolation. They happen after weeks of discussion, legal vetting, PR strategy, and ultimately, so insiders suggest, a nod from the monarch himself. So why now? Why would King Charles authorize such a visible, irreversible act of distance in August, when the world's attention was drifting towards summer holidays, not palace drama? Here's what we found. According to sources inside one of the palace's more discreet legal liaison offices, yes, those exist. The timeline wasn't random. It was triggered. Triggered by something that happened weeks earlier in Montecito. A letter. Now, we'll cover that letter in full in Chapter 6, when we dive into Harry's alleged final attempt to secure certain protections for his children. But for now, what you need to know is this. The letter didn't just appeal for inclusion. It reportedly included a list of conditions for future interaction with the monarchy. It was framed, publicly at least, as a clarification, a gentleman's request. But behind palace walls, it was read differently. It felt like a threat, said one former aide, not in words, but in structure, in tone. It was, do this or we escalate. And the palace doesn't negotiate with escalation. So within days of that letter, the wheels began to turn. Not with press briefings, with code, with back-end edits, with the slow, methodical stripping of everything that once made Harry a royal in anything but blood. Now, here's where things take a darker turn. Because the website edit didn't just happen and disappear, it triggered a second wave. A wave of quiet calls, unconfirmed but heavily suggested, to regional Commonwealth representatives. The topic, clarifying the Duke of Sussex's role, or lack thereof, in any future royal functions or state ceremonies. One Australian official called the conversation unexpectedly direct. Another, from Canada, described it as a recalibration. And perhaps most tellingly, a Caribbean government source said this. They wanted to know how our people would feel if Harry was formally removed from the line. Hypothetically, of course. Hypothetically, that word again. So what does this tell us? That the erasure wasn't the end of something. It was the test, the quiet digital trial balloon, before a more dramatic move. And the palace is watching closely, watching public reaction, watching media framing, watching Harry's next move. Because if history tells us anything, it's this. The monarchy does not act rashly. It prepares. It prods. It places its chess pieces. And when it's ready, it strikes in silence. So the real question now is, How far are they willing to go? Is this just about identity on a webpage? Or is it the preamble to a constitutional strike, one that removes Prince Harry not just from his digital biography, but from royal history itself? We're not done. Because buried inside that website update was a second, even stranger development. A development that connects directly to the coronation, to Commonwealth law, and to a little-known clause that could be the king's final weapon. But that is coming. First, we need to talk about the man who may have pushed for this erasure more than anyone else. Because while the king may have signed off, the pressure, we're told, came from someone with far more at stake and far less to lose. He's next in line. He's had enough. And what he did behind closed doors after the Queen's death may have turned the tide completely. We're talking, of course, about Prince William. But that story begins not in the palace, but in a private estate where two brothers were supposed to reconcile. They didn't. And what happened next would reshape the future of the crown. There's a version of royal power the public never sees. No crowns, no balcony waves, no carefully choreographed walkabouts. It lives in drawing rooms after midnight, in folders marked confidential, in phone calls that never go through official switchboards, in people who never appear in photographs but decide what the photographs will show. And in recent months, that power has been quietly consolidating around one man. Not the king, the heir, Prince William. Here's the contradiction that should stop you for a second. While the world still frames William as the patient, steady, future monarch in waiting, the internal machinery of the palace has already begun to move as if he were king. Not ceremonially, strategically, and that matters. Because when Prince Harry's digital erasure took place, the order didn't just float down from Charles's desk. It moved laterally, through a network. A web of advisors, legal minds, communication strategists, and constitutional whisperers who answer not to the past, but to the future. To William, let me be careful here. This isn't about a coup, not in the dramatic sense. Charles is king. The crown is his. The authority is his, but influence is something else. And over the last 2 years, quietly, steadily, William has been building what some insiders now refer to, only half-jokingly, as a shadow cabinet. Not an official body, no formal charter, just a constellation of people whose loyalty is to the next reign, not the current one. And when it comes to Harry, that distinction is everything. Because if Charles is a father still wrestling with grief, memory, and the long shadow of Diana, William is something else entirely. He is an institution in training. He is a man who has watched his family unravel in public, who has absorbed the lessons of scandal, abdication, and divorce, and who has reached one stark conclusion: the monarchy cannot survive another loose cannon, not another brother with a microphone. Not another insider turned outsider with a story to sell. Not another royal who understands the system well enough to wound it from the inside. So when the website changed, when Harry's profile was pared back to something cold and administrative, it wasn't just Charles signaling distance. It was William's network preparing the ground. Here's what we know. In the months following the coronation, a series of private briefings took place across Kensington Palace and Clarence House. Ostensibly, they were about modernization, streamlining, redefining working royal roles in an era of shrinking public tolerance for privilege. But beneath that surface, conversation ran another thread: succession security. What happens if the line is challenged? What happens if a senior royal refuses to play by the rules? What happens if a future claimant becomes a liability rather than an asset? And, quietly, always, what happens if that royal is your brother? Sources describe a set of discussions that were less emotional than clinical. Risk assessments, reputational exposure, legal precedents, public sentiment modeling. The kind of language corporations use when deciding whether to divest from a failing subsidiary. Only this time, the subsidiary had a title, a face, a mother the world still mourns, and a book that had already done damage no palace press release could fully contain. It's important to understand how William thinks. He is not impulsive. He is not theatrical. He does not grandstand. His style is restraint, silence, long memory, And when he decides something is a problem, he doesn't confront it in public. He surrounds it, he builds consensus. He waits until the moment when the solution appears inevitable. That's what the shadow cabinet is for. Former diplomats, constitutional scholars, senior communications architects who once managed crisis for the Queen, legal advisors who understand not just the law, but how Parliament thinks when the law is tested. None of them speak on the record. Some of them no longer officially work for the palace, but they still take the calls. And when the subject turns to Harry, the tone, according to multiple sources, is no longer cautious. It's resolved. There is a line that keeps coming up in those conversations, almost like a mantra. We cannot allow a future king to inherit an unresolved liability. Not a brother, not a son, a liability. That language alone tells you how far the emotional frame has shifted. Because to William, this is no longer about reconciliation, it's about containment, and possibly removal. Now, here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. William is not just thinking about his own reign, he is thinking about his children. George, Charlotte, Louis, their future, their legitimacy, their stability. Every constitutional wobble today becomes a crisis for them tomorrow. And in that context, Harry is not just the spare who left. He is the wild card who might one day return, with grievances unresolved, with influence unaccounted for, with a platform that reaches far beyond the palace gates. From William's perspective, that is not a family issue. That is a structural risk. So when the digital erasure happened, when Harry's HRH and military identity were quietly scrubbed from the official narrative, it wasn't just a communications cleanup. It was the visible edge of a much deeper conversation, one that has been happening in rooms you will never see. Now, ask yourself something. Why didn't William publicly object? Why no statement of brotherly concern? Why no subtle briefing to friendly journalists to soften the blow? Why no symbolic gesture of unity? Silence. And in the palace, silence is never empty. Silence is coordination. Here's what one former royal correspondent, still well connected, told me off the record. William isn't emotional about Harry anymore. He's strategic. He's reached the point where he sees the situation the way the institution does, and the institution is done being hurt. That's a chilling sentence, because once a family problem becomes an institutional problem, the solutions change. Institutions don't reconcile, they restructure. They remove risk, they close chapters, and they do it quietly, before the public has time to realize a decision has even been made. Which brings us to the most unsettling question of all. Is William preparing the ground for something far more drastic than a website edit? Is the shadow cabinet quietly exploring the unthinkable? A future in which Prince Harry is not merely sidelined, but constitutionally severed from the crown's line. Let's look at the signs. In recent months, William has increased his private meetings with constitutional experts, many of whom specialize in succession law, regency frameworks, and parliamentary protocol. Not the kind of topics you'd expect to dominate the calendar of a man focused solely on charity and climate initiatives. And yet, there they are. Briefings, consultations, hypothetical scenarios, always hypothetical. What if a royal renounces allegiance? What if a royal permanently resides outside the realm? What if a royal's actions bring the monarchy into sustained disrepute? These aren't tabloid questions. These are the kinds of questions that end up in legal opinions, not gossip columns. And the answers, once written, don't disappear. They sit, waiting for the moment when they're no longer theoretical. So when the palace moved to digitally redefine Harry, to recategorize him not as a senior royal, but as a historical footnote, William's network didn't see it as an ending. They saw it as phase one, a normalization process. Step by step, you make the public accustomed to a new reality. First, he's no longer working. Then, he's no longer HRH. Then, his role is prior. Then, his children's status becomes ambiguous. Then, the question quietly shifts from where is Harry to why is Harry still there at all? And once that shift happens, the unthinkable starts to sound administrative. This is how institutions move. Not with drama, with paperwork, with precedent, with carefully chosen language that reframes what once felt impossible as merely procedural. So where does Charles stand in all this? That's the tension at the heart of the story, because the king is still the father who once walked behind Diana's coffin with his sons. He is the man who, according to those close to him, still refers to Harry as my darling boy in private moments. But he is also a monarch who waited a lifetime for the crown, a monarch whose reign is already defined by fragility, of health, of time, of public patience. And beside him stands a son who has accepted fully and without illusion that the crown is not a symbol, it's a system. And systems don't bend easily, so when William's advisors speak of future-proofing the monarchy, they are not talking about feelings, they are talking about structures. And in those structures, Harry is increasingly being seen not as a brother in exile, but as a flaw in the design. Now, before we go further, let me pause, because this is the point where the narrative usually becomes too neat. William as the cold strategist, Charles as the torn father, Harry as the wounded rebel. Reality is messier. William has his own scars. He has his own memories of being the child who had to be strong while the world watched. He has his own reasons for resenting a brother who chose escape over duty. But whatever the emotional undercurrents, the political logic is hard to ignore. And the shadow cabinet is not driven by emotion. It is driven by continuity, by the belief that the crown must be insulated from internal dissent, no matter how painful that insulation becomes. So when whispers began circulating, inside legal circles, inside palace corridors, that the line of succession might one day be revisited in relation to Harry, it wasn't dismissed as fantasy. It was logged, considered, filed, because the machinery was already in motion. The website erasure was just the visible surface. Underneath, a much larger recalibration is taking place, and the man most invested in its outcome is not the king who reigns now. It's the one who will reign next. But here's the twist. Even within William's own network, there is disagreement, not about whether Harry is a problem, but about how far the solution should go. Some argue for permanent distance, but constitutional continuity. Keep him in the line. Just irrelevant. Others, more hardline, believe that as long as Harry remains in the line of succession, no matter how distant the possibility, the monarchy carries a vulnerability it cannot fully control. And that vulnerability, they warn, could one day be exploited. By media, by politics, by history. Which side is winning that internal argument? That's the question, because the next move, whether it's a legal review, a parliamentary conversation, or a formal statement redefining succession protocols, will tell us everything. And according to multiple sources, that next move is being prepared, quietly, methodically, without fanfare, just like the last one. But before any constitutional mechanism can be activated, something else has to happen, something far more personal. A conversation that has been avoided for years, a message that, when finally delivered, may shatter whatever remains of the illusion that this is still a family story. Because at some point, the king must decide whether he is acting as a father or as the first line of defense for an institution his son may one day inherit. And that decision, we're told, is closer than anyone realizes. The letter that forced the issue has already been sent. The response has already been drafted. And when it is delivered, it will mark the true beginning of a process that no website edit can fully prepare us for. Because once the crown begins to speak in legal language rather than emotional language, the end game changes. And what comes next will not be reversible. But we're not there yet. First, we need to talk about the person who may have pushed the king hardest of all to stop hesitating. The woman who has waited decades for stability. The queen who has no sentimental attachment to the idea of a spare, and who, according to several insiders, finally said the words that broke the stalemate. Words that did not come from anger, but from calculation, and once spoken, they could not be taken back. That's where the story turns. Because the next influence on this unfolding decision does not come from a son. It comes from a wife, and what she demanded, quietly, firmly without emotion, may have tipped the balance forever. She was once the outsider, The woman who couldn't be photographed without triggering 1,000 angry headlines. The mistress turned pariah turned queen. Now she walks the halls of Buckingham Palace with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needs to explain herself. But inside the walls of power, where decisions about legacy are whispered and reputations are carved in silence, Queen Camilla is no longer a passive presence. She's a force, and according to multiple insiders, she may be the reason the king finally stopped waiting. Not for reconciliation, for removal. Let's start with something uncomfortable. Camilla has always played the long game. When the public turned on her in the 90s, when tabloid nicknames reduced her to a caricature, she didn't fight back. She waited. Waited through the backlash, waited through the loss, waited through the monarchy's deepest scandals. And when Queen Elizabeth eventually gave her blessing, tentatively, conditionally, it wasn't because Camilla had demanded her place. It was because she'd outlasted the alternatives. She was still there, dutiful, strategic, unshaken. And over the years, she became something else, the king's most trusted advisor. Not his loudest, not his flashiest, but the one whose instincts, over time, proved devastatingly accurate. Now pair that with this. Camilla has no patience for emotional indecision, especially when it threatens the institution she's spent decades trying to stabilize. And Prince Harry? He's not just a rogue relative to her. He's a danger to everything she helped rebuild. Let me be clear, this isn't about revenge. Not in the dramatic fairy tale sense. There was no evil stepmother moment. This is about optics, survival, and yes, history, because Camilla remembers exactly what Harry wrote in Spare. Every line, every implication, every accusation. How could she forget? He called her dangerous, said she had sacrificed others on the altar of her personal PR, implied she leaked stories to gain public sympathy, framed her as the ultimate manipulator. And the timing of it all? Months before her husband's coronation. At the peak of their transition from Charles and Camilla to king and queen, the backlash was immediate, but also strangely muted. The public sympathized with Camilla more than expected. Why? Because something had shifted. For the first time, she wasn't being compared to Diana. She was being compared to Meghan. And in that comparison, Camilla didn't look like a threat. She looked stable, predictable, resilient, royal. That subtle shift in public mood gave her leverage. And, according to those close to the Queen's private circle, she used it. Not in loud declarations, not in media manipulation. In strategy, she began raising quiet concerns about Harry's continued visibility in royal structures, about the risk he posed, not just emotionally, but reputationally, and more importantly, constitutionally. Here's what we've learned. Camilla allegedly held multiple private briefings with senior communications staff between March and June of this year. Ostensibly, they were about coronation messaging, how to position the royal family post-Charles's crowning, how to draw a line under the Sussex chapter. But those present say something else happened in those meetings. Camilla asked a question, one that startled even seasoned palace insiders. Why is he still in the line? It was delivered quietly. Not as a command, but as a provocation. Because once that question is asked, you can't unask it. It lingers. It forces the institution to look at its own contradictions. Harry had walked away. He had published a memoir attacking the core of royal identity. He had disclosed private conversations, questioned royal advisors, and launched a media empire rooted in criticism of the very system he was born into. And yet, his name still sat fifth in the line of succession, one heartbeat away from potentially being a regent, one heartbeat away from public expectation. To Camilla, that wasn't just a contradiction. It was a liability, especially for Charles. Because every day Harry remained in the line, the media had a hook, the critics had ammunition, and the crown had an open wound. So she began pushing, gently, quietly, strategically. First, through whispers, then through briefings. And finally, according to one insider, through a private conversation with Charles that, while deeply personal, had one unambiguous message: you cannot carry him into your legacy. Let's pause here, because that line matters. Camilla wasn't asking Charles to disown his son. She was telling him something deeper, that his monarchy would not survive unless he drew a line between fatherhood and kingship, between regret and responsibility. And Charles, who had waited 70 years to wear the crown, understood what that meant. He didn't agree immediately. He hesitated. Of course he did. This was his child, his darling boy. But Camilla, she had seen what hesitation costs. She had lived it. The breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage, the years of silence, the mishandling of grief, the public relations disasters that followed. She knew that the public punishes uncertainty more than it punishes power. So when the Queen of England urges the king to act, not emotionally, but structurally, it isn't dismissed, it is discussed, weighed, and eventually authorized. What came next was weeks of movement, none of it visible to the public. Legal queries, constitutional precedent checks, draft memos for internal use only. But the first public-facing action, the website. It was Camilla, sources say, who backed the decision to begin there. Clean, subtle, controlled, a trial balloon to measure response. And when the backlash didn't come, when Harry and Meghan issued no official protest, when the press mostly shrugged, it signaled something important. The public was already moving on. And so Camilla doubled down. She began aligning with William. Yes, Camilla and William, once thought to have a chilly relationship, found common ground in a single objective: stability at any cost. They began coordinating more closely, briefing the same advisors, speaking sometimes without Charles present. And what united them was not spite, it was control. Because Harry was a variable neither could manage. A brother, a son, a wild card, too unpredictable, too well-liked, too independent. And if he was allowed to linger in the constitutional structure, he would always pose a risk, no matter how many oceans or lawsuits separated them. So Camilla did what Camilla does best. She waited, she lobbied softly, she asked the right questions to the right people at the right times. And behind closed doors, she changed the mood. What had once been unthinkable began to sound inevitable. Let me be careful not to overstate this. Camilla didn't issue an order. She doesn't rule by decree, but her influence, subtle, disciplined, unflinching, is now embedded in the very way decisions are made, especially decisions that affect legacy. Because for Camilla, this isn't just about Harry. It's about what the monarchy becomes after Charles, and she's made it clear, publicly and privately, that she sees her role not as an interlude, but as a steward, a queen who holds the bridge between two reigns, one that must not crumble on her watch. So when she told Charles in one of their late-night conversations that Harry was threatening that bridge, he listened, and not long after, the edits began. The profile vanished. The metadata was recoded, and the future began to narrow. Now, here's the quiet irony in all of this. For years, the public saw Camilla as the intruder, the woman who broke tradition, the dangerous outsider. But in this moment, she may be the one defending the institution most fiercely, not from scandal, from uncertainty, because if Camilla stands for anything now, it's finality. No more half measures, no more second chances. No more waiting for the phone to ring from California. Harry made his choice, and Camilla made sure the crown responded. What's still unclear is how far she's willing to go, because removing a name from a website is one thing. Removing a name from the line of succession, that's something else. Something historic, constitutional, explosive. But if sources are right, she's already prepared for that. And she's not the only one. Because someone else, someone you may not expect, recently received a legal briefing on what it would take to finalize the process. It wasn't a royal, it was a government official. And the fact that they were even looped in tells us everything, because once the crown and the government begin coordinating language, especially around succession, what follows is no longer symbolic, it's structural. And that is where this story turns from quiet exile into outright constitutional redesign. We'll get to that, but first, we need to rewind, because this entire campaign, this pressure, this erasure, this redefinition of identity wasn't launched in a vacuum. It was triggered by a letter, a deeply personal, emotionally charged, legally phrased letter from Harry, sent not to William, not to the Prime Minister, to Charles. And what it said, what it asked, and what it implied may have pushed the king from doubt into action. But the most chilling part, Camilla read it first. And after she did, she allegedly gave Charles just 5 words of advice. You know what you must do. What was in that letter, and why did it change everything? That's where we're going next. And what we found will leave you questioning not just the king's choices, but Harry's too. You can take down a name from a website, you can cut off titles, deny security, ban balcony appearances, erase patronages. But can a king actually remove his own son from the line of succession? Can he, constitutionally, rewrite the future of the monarchy, not just emotionally, but legally? The answer is complicated. And buried beneath centuries of monarchy, scandal, and precedent is a chilling truth. The British line of succession isn't just a family tree. It's a legal structure with roots older than most modern democracies. And yet, it might not be as permanent as it looks. Let's start with the basics. The rules governing who inherits the British throne are set out in a patchwork of laws, royal decrees, and centuries-old parliamentary acts. It's not one clean document. It's a maze. At its core are 3 foundational pieces of legislation: the Bill of Rights, 1689, the Act of Settlement, 1701, the Succession to the Crown Act, 2013. Together, these laws establish key principles. The monarch must be Protestant. Succession must follow hereditary bloodlines, traditionally male preference primogeniture, now changed to absolute primogeniture. Thanks to the 2013 reform, the line of succession can only be altered by Parliament, not unilaterally by the monarch. That last point is crucial. King Charles cannot, by royal fiat, remove Prince Harry from the succession. He cannot simply issue a decree or call it an internal family matter. Because unlike royal patronages, which the monarch controls directly, the succession is a matter of constitutional law, and changing it, that requires an act of Parliament. But here's where it gets murkier. The 2013 Act, passed ahead of the birth of Prince George, modernized succession law, making it gender-neutral and ending the disqualification of royals who married Catholics. But it left a door open. It reaffirmed that Parliament has the authority to change the succession as it sees fit, which means if a king wants to remove someone from the line, and if he has political support, it can be done. The challenge is how, because it's never been done before, at least, not in modern history. Sure, King Edward VIII abdicated, but that was voluntary. Yes, royals have lost titles, honors, military roles, but no living royal has ever been forcibly removed from the line of succession without committing treason or converting to Catholicism, as was once grounds for disqualification. Which brings us to Harry. He hasn't broken the law. He hasn't converted. He hasn't renounced his royal status, but he has, many argue, undermined the monarchy, repeatedly, publicly, relentlessly, and the crown has noticed. So the question becomes, can Harry be removed not because he's ineligible, but because he's incompatible? That's the legal and constitutional frontier Buckingham Palace is reportedly exploring. And the conversations, still quiet, still coded, are growing more serious. Let's take a look at what's allegedly been discussed behind the scenes. One potential option, a royal succession bill. This would be legislation introduced in Parliament that revises the Succession to the Crown Act to exclude Prince Harry and possibly his children from the line. It would be unprecedented, controversial, politically risky, but technically possible. For it to pass, it would need approval from the House of Commons, the House of Lords, the monarch, in practice, a formality, and possibly all 15 Commonwealth realms that recognize Charles as head of state. Yes, you read that right. If Charles wants to remove Harry from the line across the full Commonwealth, not just in the UK, it would require coordination with Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and others. Each would need to pass similar legislation. You see the problem? This isn't just constitutional law, it's diplomacy, it's international coordination, it's optics. And yet, there's a precedent for this kind of coordination. In 2011, when the monarchy modernized the rules of succession to allow for equal treatment of male and female heirs, the Commonwealth nations cooperated to pass identical laws. It took time, quiet diplomacy, but it happened. And according to insiders, some of the same legal minds involved in that process have recently been consulted again. Their brief? Explore the feasibility of a new amendment. This time, focus not on gender, but on behavior. A behavior clause. An idea that if a royal acts in sustained opposition to the crown, if they damage the institution they are destined to inherit, they can be disqualified, not as punishment, but as preservation. Think about that. The crown wouldn't be removing Harry out of vengeance. It would be preserving institutional stability. That framing matters, because Parliament doesn't like personal feuds. It doesn't legislate family disputes, but if the issue can be reframed as constitutional protection, as a matter of succession integrity, then the door opens. Now we must also consider an alternative route, one even more subtle, the Regency Act loophole. Under the Regency Acts of 1937 and 1953, if the monarch is incapacitated or underage, a regent is appointed from among the next few adults in the line of succession. But to serve as regent, you must meet certain criteria. Be of age, be domiciled in the UK, and be deemed capable of fulfilling royal duties. That last bit, capable, is undefined, which means that a committee made up of the monarch's spouse, the Lord Chancellor, the Speaker of the House of Commons, and a few others could theoretically rule someone unfit to serve as regent. It wouldn't remove Harry from the line, but it would block him from serving in any capacity of responsibility, even temporarily. Some insiders believe this may be the path of least resistance. You leave his name, but you neutralize his power, symbolically, legally, constitutionally. And from the palace's perspective, that might be enough. But what about Harry's children, Archie and Lilibet? If Harry is removed, are they removed too? That's a legal question no one wants to touch yet. But privately, the conversation is happening. Because if Charles, or Parliament, sets a precedent that behavior can affect succession rights, then inheritance becomes conditional. And, if it's conditional for Harry, how can it not be conditional for his children? Now let's shift to the crown's prerogatives. While Charles cannot unilaterally change the succession, he can restrict access to titles, honors, and styles. He can issue letters patent that redefine who gets to be a prince or princess. Queen Elizabeth did this in 2012 for William and Kate's children. Charles could do the opposite. He could declare, for instance, that only grandchildren of the monarch who are in active service of the crown shall use HRH or princely styles. It would be surgical, clean, targeted. It wouldn't remove Archie and Lilibet from the line, but it would remove their royal identity. And over time, with public perception, that becomes just as powerful. Because monarchy isn't just legal, it's symbolic. And symbols, once weakened, rarely recover. So what's next? According to our sources, a working group is being assembled. Not under that name, of course. But legal experts, constitutional historians, and discreet parliamentary allies are being looped into exploratory conversations. The goal? To identify which tools exist within the law to begin redefining royal eligibility based not just on blood, but on conduct. It's a dangerous path. Because once you start defining who is worthy of the crown, you invite scrutiny on everyone, and no royal, no matter how polished, is without contradictions. But from where the palace is sitting, the alternative is worse. Do nothing. Allow Harry to remain in the line. Allow tabloids to speculate. Allow crises to linger. Allow a future where the monarchy has to keep explaining why a man who called the institution racist, colonial, and broken is still next in line after 4 children. That's not just a PR nightmare. It's an existential dilemma. So the king, the queen, and the heir are quietly circling the one option they once thought unthinkable. Not out of rage, out of realism, because the institution has survived abdications, assassinations, divorces, and wars. But it has never survived ambivalence. And that's what Harry represents now. Not a rebellion, not a rival. A question mark, a constitutional gap. And the monarchy doesn't leave gaps open. It closes them. The only question is how, because the moment that pen is lifted to strike his name or to redefine the rules, the crown will cross a line it can't walk back. But they may have already started, because one official, briefed just last month, left the meeting with this quote scribbled in the margin of a legal draft. Precedent must begin here. But this process wasn't spontaneous. It was triggered by a letter, Harry's letter. And what it said, what it threatened, what it pleaded for, was unlike anything the king had received before. It wasn't just personal. It was a proposition, a challenge. And once Camilla read it, she passed it to Charles, who handed it, quietly, to his lawyers. Next, we read that letter, and what it reveals will explain everything that followed. It began with a courier, not an email. Not a phone call, not even a letter delivered through palace channels. A sealed envelope, hand-delivered by a private intermediary, bearing no official insignia, but known to every gatekeeper inside Clarence House. It arrived 3 weeks before the website edit, 11 days after a closed-door roundtable between Commonwealth legal representatives, and exactly 5 years after the day Meghan Markle first set foot on Canadian soil as a royal fiancé. Coincidence? Maybe. But what was inside that envelope would set in motion a legal and diplomatic chain reaction that's still playing out now across continents, courtrooms, and crown councils. They call it, unofficially, the Toronto Papers, and they may be the final nail in the constitutional coffin for Prince Harry. Let's step back. Because before we open that envelope, we need to understand the context. When Harry and Meghan stepped down from royal duties in early 2020, they initially intended to split their time between the UK and North America, with Canada floated as their preferred half-home. Back then, the idea seemed plausible. Canada is a Commonwealth realm. It's part of the Crown, it had hosted royal tours for over a century, and the Canadian public, for the most part, liked the Sussexes, especially Meghan. She had filmed suits there, lived there, had roots, so the idea of the couple remaining semi-royal while residing in a friendly constitutional monarchy seemed possible, until it wasn't. What followed was a rapid unraveling. Meghan and Harry moved to California. The Sandringham summit collapsed into competing narratives. The Oprah interview detonated, and the prospect of a part-time royal arrangement died, quietly, but definitively. But in Canada, the conversation never really stopped. Because unlike in the UK, where royal protocol is set in stone, the Canadian legal system treats monarchy as both a symbolic and functional structure, which means when Harry relocated to North America and began criticizing the crown from a foreign jurisdiction, Canadian legal experts took notice. And sometime between late 2021 and early 2022, internal discussions began, quietly, among constitutional scholars, in Ottawa and, we're told, in Toronto. The question, if a member of the royal family lives abroad, is not a working royal, and engages in behavior that undermines the institution, can that realm choose to disqualify them from succession recognition? The idea wasn't to punish Harry, it was to define policy, because Canada isn't just a royal fan club. It's a constitutional monarchy in its own right. And if the Duke of Sussex were ever to ascend the throne, even hypothetically, he would become King of Canada, a head of state. So, what if Canada doesn't want him? That's where the Toronto Papers come in. A leaked internal draft, circulated among senior policy advisors, academics, and judicial consultants, outlines a potential legal framework for defining constitutional incompatibility with succession rights, establishing behavioral thresholds for disqualification, coordinating with other Commonwealth realms for a uniform response. The draft, according to sources who have seen portions of it, is meticulous. It references the Statute of Westminster, 1931, the Letters Patent of 1917 and 1947, the Succession to the Crown Act, 2013, and even debates surrounding the abdication crisis of Edward VIII, But what makes it extraordinary isn't the legal research. It's the tone. It doesn't name Harry directly, but it doesn't have to. Every paragraph refers to a royal who has renounced duties, resides outside the realm, and has participated in sustained public criticism of the crown. That's not hypothetical, that's a profile. And it matches only one person. Now here's where things get explosive. While the Toronto papers were never intended to be released publicly, someone leaked a summary of their contents to key Commonwealth stakeholders. And within weeks, a version of those findings reached Buckingham Palace. More precisely, they reached Queen Camilla. And within 48 hours of that, they were on the king's desk. We can't say definitively who leaked them, but what we do know is this. A senior Canadian diplomat, now retired, has confirmed that a confidential position paper on succession dynamics was shared with UK counterparts in early summer 2023. And that paper contained the following sentence. Continued inclusion of constitutionally incompatible successors may pose reputational risk to the monarchy in this and other realms. Translated, keep Harry in the line, and the crown could face a multinational legitimacy crisis. That's not politics. That's not family drama. That's institutional emergency language. And it forced a response. Because once the idea of removing Harry gained legal scaffolding, even abroad, palace advisors had to take it seriously. So what did Charles do? He commissioned a review, quietly. He tasked a private legal team, independent from the usual Lord Chamberlain circle, with evaluating whether the monarchy could accommodate such legal frameworks in its own succession planning. The result? A confidential legal briefing delivered via the courier we mentioned earlier. The envelope, the one marked only with the personal crest of the king. That document is what insiders now refer to as the trigger point. It didn't recommend immediate removal. It didn't demand legislative action. But it concluded, unequivocally, that the sovereign is within rights to propose succession reconsideration on grounds of constitutional stability. That language matters, because once a king receives legal cover for removal, not emotional justification, but constitutional framing, his options change. What had once been unthinkable becomes a matter of timing. So the palace waited, watched, measured reaction, and then, quietly, Harry was removed. From the website, his digital presence was redacted, his metadata deleted, his ceremonial roles erased. Not just as punishment, but as precedent. Because the Toronto papers didn't just provoke a legal review, they shifted the center of gravity from personal drama to constitutional logic. And constitutional logic is cold. It doesn't care about hurt feelings or memoir sales. It cares about structure, continuity, preservation. Let me be clear, the Toronto papers are not legislation. They are not binding. They do not have the power to change the line on their own. But they do something far more dangerous. They normalize the conversation. They turn removing Harry from a royal family squabble into a policy discussion. And once that happens, it's no longer a question of if, it's a question of how soon. Now here's the part that hasn't been reported. One of the legal architects of the Toronto papers used to work on the Commonwealth Secretariat's constitutional reform team. He has deep ties to Australia, New Zealand, and the Caribbean realms, which means the model developed in Canada could be exported. Standardized, copied, what starts as a Canadian proposal could become a Commonwealth-wide mechanism. And at that point, Charles's hands wouldn't even need to move. He could let the realms do the heavy lifting. He would simply honor their wishes. It's tidy and devastating, because for Harry, it would mean removal not by father, but by consensus. By the very nations he once sought to reconnect with. Now let's turn to Meghan. Sources say she was briefed on the Toronto papers, informally, weeks before the website edit. And her reaction? Panic. Not anger. Not defiance. Not another sit-down interview plan. Just panic. Because for all the independence she and Harry have built, media deals, production companies, charities, the symbolic power of royalty still underpins their relevance. Remove that, and they risk becoming something worse than controversial. They risk becoming irrelevant. That's the real threat. Not exile, obscurity. And Meghan, who understands media better than most, knows it. We're told she initiated a flurry of quiet calls to advisors, to former Canadian legal contacts, even to former colleagues in Toronto, looking for answers, trying to understand how real this was, whether it could be stopped, whether it could be reversed. But by the time those calls were placed, the machinery was already turning, and Charles, he had already asked his private secretary to begin succession language research. That phrase, succession language research, is what tipped off some parliamentary observers that something bigger was coming. Because that's not cleanup, that's planning. Planning for a moment when the king may be asked, publicly, explicitly, whether Harry should remain in the line. And when that moment comes, the king will need one thing above all: a precedent. The Toronto papers provide that. They give him cover. They give him language. They give him legal oxygen. And from that oxygen comes fire. We're not done. Because before any of this can move into action, something else had to happen. The king needed a trigger, a final push, a moment that removed all ambiguity. And it came not from Toronto, but from Montecito. A letter from Harry, a personal, emotionally complex, legally phrased letter sent after he saw the Toronto rumors, after he heard the whispers. And what he asked for was not peace, it was power. Next, we read that letter, and once you hear what it said, you'll understand why the king never looked back. It wasn't an olive branch, it wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a plea for forgiveness. The letter Prince Harry sent to King Charles arrived without ceremony, but carried the weight of a family on the brink, and an institution on the edge of rewriting its own bloodline. This wasn't Harry as the wounded son. This was Harry, the strategist. Harry, the challenger. Harry, the Duke of Sussex, writing not to his father, but to his monarch. And what he wrote would shift the tone of everything that followed. Because while the Toronto papers stirred the waters of legal possibility, this letter turned them into a storm. Let's break it down. The letter itself was handwritten, yes, in Harry's own writing, which insiders say is unusually neat and precise, a habit born from military discipline. But a typed version accompanied it. Lawyer-reviewed, annotated, and structured in formal terms. It arrived not through email, not through a diplomatic pouch, but through a third-party intermediary, someone from Harry's circle, trusted but untraceable to the press. It was addressed to His Majesty King Charles III, not Dad, not Pa. There was no intimacy in the header, only protocol. From the first line, the tone was unmistakable, controlled, legalistic, and quietly provocative. Sources familiar with the letter's content describe it as deeply respectful in language, but unmistakably firm in intention. Let's pause there, because intention is everything. Harry was not asking for reconciliation. He was asserting rights, rights as a royal, rights as a father, rights as someone who, despite everything, remained in the line of succession. The core message? You may control the institution, but I will not allow you to erase me from it. It was a preemptive strike delivered before any formal move had been made, but clearly responding to the rising legal and symbolic threats surrounding his royal identity. And at the heart of the letter were three key demands: clarity on the status of his children in the line of succession, formal confirmation of his position within the constitutional framework of the monarchy, a request to be informed immediately of any discussions related to the alteration of succession rights. Now, let's unpack each of those. 1. Clarity on the status of Archie and Lilibet. This was where the emotion crept in. While much of the letter was clinical, this section carried a tone of quiet desperation. Harry wrote, reportedly, that his